When I was 17, I started getting panic attacks, and that kind of level of panic attack where you genuinely think you're dying, 100%, no question in your mind. You're saying your last goodbyes, call an ambulance, I'm dying. It's terrifying, obviously. And that was something I had to deal with on essentially a daily basis for a very long time until I was able to get it under control. And I decided that the way to deal with that was to learn about death.
This is the When You Die podcast. If it has to do with death and dying, we're talking about it. Today's host is Kelly Edwards.
On the podcast, we are joined by Kathy Benjamin. Kathy is a writer who has recently released her book called It's Your Funeral: Plan the Celebration of a Lifetime Before It's Too Late. And Kathy joins us from her home in Austin, Texas. Hi, Kathy.
Hi, thanks for having me.
We're very happy to have you here. I will tell you, we did a contest to give away a couple of copies of the book, and people went crazy. The idea of it, everybody was like, I want this book, I want this book. So we could have given away 100. We give 2, and they're very happy with it. And so we've been telling people to get out and buy it because it's fun, but it's also important. And it's something that a lot of people don't want to face.
Yeah, especially I think right now it was a very weird timing for writing and putting out the book. But I think it just kind of maybe everything that's happened in the past 2 years is kind of that wake up call of like, yeah, you do have to think about it. You really don't know. And that sucks. I'm not going to say it doesn't suck. And it is something you have to just kind of face head on. But that's why with this book, I tried to make it a lot less scary because it is scary and it can be scary. And I think approaching it with humor and kind of matter of fact and a lot of information, it just makes it a little bit easier to at least get started on the idea.
Absolutely. I want to read a little something here. This is just in the intro, an introduction to your end. But one of the things that I loved was it says, if all of this sounds too sad or scary to contemplate, it's okay. You're not alone. Take comfort in knowing that the best way to conquer your fear and anxiety about death is to face it head on. And I know that this is true for you, particularly.
Yes, it was very heartfelt. That was very personal there because when I was 17, I started getting panic attacks, and that kind of level of panic attack where you genuinely think you're dying, 100%, no question in your mind. You're saying your last goodbyes, call an ambulance, I'm dying. It's terrifying, obviously. And that was something I had to deal with on essentially a daily basis for a very long time until I was able to get it under control. And I decided that the way to deal with that was to learn about death. A historian by trade, and so I wanted to learn about the history of death and the history of funerals and things like that. And it's just that kind of that kind of student thing of like, if I just learn, then it'll be okay. And it did in the end. It took a long time, but now I've written 2 books about death. It's something that I essentially, for one reason or another, have to think about every day for quite a long time. My husband and I, we've been trying to get our steps in. We go to cemeteries, which are beautiful, like artistic places. Yeah, so it is something that if you do face it, if you do that work, and I'm not saying it's easy, it was very hard for me, you can really get to a point where, again, you're not looking forward to it. It's not something that's great, but you can at least deal with it on a more kind of clinical level.
When you were talking about that with panic attacks and how it manifested itself, it affected your quality of life.
Oh, hugely. Yeah. I mean, not to get too personal or whatever. I did go to therapy and take medication, but to deal with it for 15 years to function, I drank. I was an alcoholic. I've been sober for almost 4 years now. Yeah, completely led to things that really, really did affect my life in negative ways. So it was very important to kind of get that under control eventually.
So I was looking up some things, and you had written a lot of things for certainly humor with the Cracked publication, and then with this grunge. So your historian plays a part there. So all of the articles have different categories, might be entertainment, might be history, might be lifestyle, whatever, but they're all about death.
I do write about death a lot. Yeah, I do try and get it in there. It's one of those things where, especially with articles where you have like a quicker turnaround, if you already have a lot of research on it, it just makes it easier to write them. But it's something that fascinates me just absolutely completely. I think having looked at it historically, I put it up there with language and religion as something that is incredibly important for what makes humans humans and what took us from essentially being animals to being humans, and something that's a huge part of our life is facing what happens after and what happens when the people we love die, and how do we honor that. And I think when you look at how people did that historically, and I like to say that we've taken 100,000 years of, we're all dealing with the same feeling, which is grief. And so what we do for funerals, no matter what part of the world, no matter what culture, is 100,000 years at least of humans trying to deal with the exact same thing.
And it doesn't matter when you were born, we've all got that and we all have to face it. And this book, it's really great because it's informative. Everything is in there in terms of planning your end. But one of the things I love is that it's comforting. There's certainly the guidance of here are definite things that you need to look at that frankly, when I was looking at it, stuff I hadn't even thought about. We're also looking at death every day, but there are the delicate little details of things. And then there's fun facts about funerals or stuff. It's not sad, it's not maudlin, it's not morbid. It's just this really lovely combination. And it's a workbook.
Yes, you get a couple pages of information. It's in categories, and I kind of go from like what I think is the biggest thing, which is what's going to be done with your body. Like, do you want to be cremated or buried, or one of the many other options that a lot of people don't know you have? So you get information on all that. So once you get to the work page where you put down either your thoughts or ideas or what you want 100% completely, you have that information, or at least a jumping off place to get more information. And then you can record it, and then it will move on to like things about your funeral. At the end, I have things about your digital legacy, which is one of those things that I think a lot of people forget, especially these days. How are people going to get into your bank accounts and your emails and things like that? So it's all in there. And then the idea is that you have this book, and you can either, I would hope, have conversations with your loved ones about it. But if you can't, then you can at least say, here's a book, here's what I want, it's right there. If I die, just go have a look and you'll know all the things that I want. And it'll make planning for the people you love most in the world that much easier.
I love that part of it too, because there's a thing that says that you turn the funeral process into an act of love instead of a source of worry.
Yeah.
If we all haven't experienced it yet, we will. But someone who dies, particularly someone who died suddenly or someone that you haven't had that conversation, and then you have to try and guess what they would have liked. This
Yeah.
makes it so much easier and more clear.
And sum up, the idea of summing up, one of the things that I talked to both friends and people and also funeral directors during this whole process was the big complaint was that they go to a funeral of like a close friend or something, but not someone where they weren't the next of kin and they didn't plan the funeral, but they care about this person, and they go to the funeral and they don't see the person they knew reflected back at them, and how it did not help with their mourning in any way, and how in some cases it made it worse, that they were upset that this funeral did not reflect the person they knew. One of the things that people have talked about, I think, especially now as we become more secular, if you're panicking and you're like, we have to have a funeral, your first thought maybe is going to be a house of worship. But a lot of people aren't religious anymore. And one thing I heard from a lot of people was the funeral was in a church. He never went to church in his life. He never mentioned church. And so even just that basics of like, where do we have this? Where are we allowed to have this? And how do we do it? Can be alienating for people. And you understand on the one hand, because the family, at the end of the day, again, the reason we do this is suddenly you have a dead body, and dead bodies have to go away because it's not safe for anyone. And so there is that time pressure. So if you don't have any plans and you have this time pressure in a very basic way, you're going to just make a lot of times the easy decision, which it may not be the best act of love for the person that you lost.
And also, you liken it to planning a wedding in the sense that you've got all of these details and cost, but you've got not a year or two to plan it. You've got a few days.
Exactly. That was basically the first thing I did was look up numbers, because I personally have never had to pay for a funeral myself. And so I looked up the numbers and I just went, whoa. And I put in the book, I believe I put in the intro $10,000, which is when we're talking about full burial. Obviously, if you're doing cremation, it can be less expensive. But if you're doing just a standard in a coffin, full body burial, it's actually more than that. That was kind of the best source I could get, and I could stick with that. But really, you're edging up. I mean, honestly, it does kind of get up there to wedding price at some point. I think the average wedding is like 18,000 or something. So they're comparable. And yeah, if you said to someone like, here's the 15 grand you're going to spend on your wedding, you have 5 days, go. And it has to completely reflect your love for the person. When we were talking about venue, it's like if you have 5 to 7 days of getting a venue for your wedding, is it going to be the perfect place that you want, or is it going to be a place that's available? So I think for me, I think it is a good comparison because it is essentially trying to plan a very sad wedding, a wedding no one wants to go
Yes,
to in a
really.
week. And you're crying the whole time instead of being excited and happy. You're really upset the whole time. Yeah.
And we hear so many stories of families that get kind of torn apart because of disagreements where people come into this saying, no, mom would have wanted this. No, I know she would have wanted this. There's no definite hard and fast thing written down.
That's one of the things too when you think about how the funeral reflects the person back. Your relationship with everyone exactly is different. So maybe the friend who did go to that funeral in the church and was like, what is this? Maybe to the person's daughter, it actually did reflect their relationship. So what you really want is for the person that was lost to be reflected the way they want to be reflected, because that's kind of, you're saying goodbye to them. That's what's important before you even get into the will kind of issue. Like families will get torn apart about this. And I put things like that in there. Who gets what jewelry? Big questions like that. Because you don't want during that period, again, I just keep going back to it, people dealing with grief and sadness, and then you throw in all this stuff that doesn't have to be thrown in. And that even if you can't get yourself to have these conversations beforehand, which I very much encourage, you can at least have things written down in a way where it's like, okay, so and so says this and so says this, but in this person's handwriting, they've written down this is what they want.
And, one of the things that I loved in here was there is the section about your playlist. And music is so important to most people. I love that you have like, here's a form for your playlist, but then here's a form for do not play this. I think that is great. I never would have thought of that.
Yeah, I thought of it for kind of for two reasons. A lot of people play like Yesterday or Imagine, and I'm fine with the Beatles. I'm fine with John Lennon on his own. I hate both of those songs. I hate them. Like if someone played Imagine at my funeral, I would be so angry. I've been very angry. But then also, and in fact, I put it on the list, is Ding Dong the Witch is Dead. My husband is British, and when Margaret Thatcher died, who was very controversial, there was an online movement to buy Ding Dong the Witch is Dead, so it would be number one that week on the on the charts, and it was. It's like, okay, yeah, these are things that you kind of have to think about. Yeah.
Yeah. The thing about putting it down too is, as you said before, it's written down. There's no discrepancy here as to say if you're playing Ding Dong the Witch is Dead and I didn't ask for it, that's a that's on
Yeah.
you.
Yeah. I don't mean to say that like you can't have fun with your playlist. I think that's definitely fun. I think a lot of people, apparently, especially in England, do always look on the bright side of life from The Life of Brian. That's a very popular choice, which is fabulous and it's funny and it does still fit. We all have kind of those songs that would seem very funeral like that we hate. So don't
Um,
go the easy way. Don't play Imagine. Oh,
so when you came to write the book, what was the thing that motivated you to do it? Obviously, there's a need for it and to put it all together. I guess this is a two-part question too, is like, how did it come about? But then also, how did you decide to flavor it with the humor? Because death is serious and somber and sad. In most cases, people think of it that way. So you took this other road and went, no, let's put the fun in funeral.
yes, it is. It's always weird to answer this question, but what motivated me was I got an email from the publisher asking if I wanted to write it, and I said yes. But I had written Funerals to Die For a few years ago, and they had come up with It's Your Funeral, the idea in house. They had envisioned something quite different, almost more of a pamphlet, something very short that was more just workbook. And so I kind of went back to them and was like, okay, I feel like we need to make this more informative and we need to expand on things. And so we went back and forth on that. But it was perfect because it was something that I was so passionate about beforehand. In fact, I think 2 days after I signed the contract for it, I got a Facebook memory from 5 years before where I had basically said the thesis of the book of like, please, you guys, especially ever since I wrote Funerals to Die For, that I was like, this is something that needs to get done. And it was happening more and more then. It's happening all the time now. The thing that kills me is seeing the GoFundMe's for funerals because, again, they're so expensive. And especially if it's a death you're not expecting. Do you have 10 grand in your account that you just boom, next week go? And then obviously during COVID, that was so much more. You just constantly saw them. And so that really, really killed me. And so I wanted to get it out there for people. The timing was totally coincidental. I was contacted in early March by the publisher, early March 2020. So right as the pandemic was starting, and then I wrote it through that first wave. It ended up being that kind of timing of like, wow, we just saw what can happen. We're very tired. We don't want to think about it. We're all living it right now. So let's laugh because at this point, all you can do is laugh and let's just get a few things down, plan something.
And that's a pretty fast turnaround for an entire book. It's not a small book.
Yeah, I wrote it over, I think it was 6 or 7 months. And then it was published almost a year after that. Yeah. I mean, I think it felt slow at the time. Publishing. Yeah. So it was about, it was a year and a half basically between being contacted about it and it being published. And yeah, the whole time it was the whole COVID pandemic. There were a couple days where it would just be like I'd have a chapter due or something, or I'd have a chapter due in a couple days and I'd just email them and be like, look, today I can't sit down and make jokes. Like I've just checked the death list right as I woke up and I just can't do it today. So it was a very weird kind of compartmentalization. But in a way, it also helped me kind of get through it because it was like, okay, this is why I'm doing this.
And how did it work itself in the humor? Did you know right off the bat that you were going to have that element to it?
When I started writing for Cracked, that was how I was taught to be a writer. And then Funerals to Die For is also tongue in cheek. There are other workbooks like this out there, and they all have like roses on the front and scripty letters and blah, blah. And those are great. Like, seriously, yeah, as long as you're playing it, I don't care what you get. But they're definitely more just a put down what you want, and this is serious and it's very sad and everything. And there's really not one of those out there. And I looked that is humorous. And so I think not everyone is going to be motivated and drawn to that kind of maudlin one. The funeral itself is sad. Losing someone is sad. Everything around it doesn't have to be. Some people would say maybe it's not appropriate or whatever. We have dark humor. We have foxhole trench humor for a reason. It's like the idea of like the soldier is making jokes about death and things when they're on the front line. That's what you do because that's how people get through it. I don't cross any lines in this. I'm not inappropriate about death. I'm still respectful of the idea and the person reading it, but you can still have a laugh. You can still have a laugh. It's fine. It's how we are going to deal with this thing that, is gonna suck.
And that's true. And in my reading it, going through it and stuff, and I would find myself laughing at things. It starts making me think of funny things that I could actually plan to make sort of raise the mood a bit when I'm gone, that it doesn't all have to be, because especially if you are a person that humor is important and that you have a funniness about you, why would you want someone to sit through a very sad service that didn't reflect you at all?
Now you do see more the kind of idea of it's a celebration of life. There's an example in the book of the man in Ireland with one of his daughters made it so that as he was being put in the grave, there was a recording and he was like, help, what? Oh, it's dark, get me out of here. Which personally for me, I would not like
No.
at all. But everyone who was there like immediately got it and his daughter was a part of it and everything. And so I think if that's what reflected this man, good for him. But there's also an example of a man who always got Burger King. And so the hearse went through a drive-through and got one last Whopper for him and everything like that. And so those are things you kind of hear those and you go, okay, I know who this person was. And you don't even know them. Definitely adding those kind of things to your own funeral plans. People are going to go, oh, yeah, that's so-and-so, as opposed to we're all singing a hymn that's sad and crying or something, which I will say, I'm also a fan of the sad funeral. I think that is a perfectly legitimate thing. People do need that moment of release and crying. So it's just kind of what you want, what you think your loved ones will want, and what will help people grieve at the end of the day.
People plan weddings from when they're a child. So why aren't we doing the same thing with funerals? Because we're afraid. Is it that sort of thing of like it's bad luck to talk about it because then it could happen? But guess what? It's going to happen.
Yeah, I suppose when it comes to a wedding, the comparison would be like people who need to and don't want to sign a prenup, because if you sign a prenup, then you're going to get divorced. And it's like, well, you could get divorced. You don't know, so you prepare for these things. Well, the great divorce with life is definitely going to happen. So you may as well prepare. Like you can go your entire life never talking about your death, never thinking about it. You're still going to die. It's the one thing that is going to happen to literally everyone. I don't want to use the word selfish because I understand not wanting to think about death, let me tell you. But it's this idea of like, even if it's scary, even if it's going to take a hard sitting down and looking at yourself and dealing with some realities for a couple hours or something, think of how hard it is. And a lot of people probably have experience of how hard it is for your loved ones when you die and there's no plan at all and there's no money and there's no idea of what you want done and there's just nothing. And the reality of someone dying and then immediately the reality of, oh my gosh, we have to plan this wedding size thing. It's an act of love. It's an act of caring, of saying, yeah, even if, and especially if it's hard for me to sit down and do this, I'm doing it because I want people I love's lives to be better. I like the comparison of like parents. I don't have children, but parents always say, I'd take a bullet for my child. And I'm like, okay, so you'll take a bullet for your child, but then you won't sit down and talk to them about what they need to do after you've taken that bullet. Like that's the line for you. You're willing to die for them. You're just not willing to talk about what funeral you want after you die because that's too much.
That's right.
So yeah, you do. Everyone does things for their loved ones, and this is something you should do for your loved ones, even if it's hard. Yeah,
That's certainly what the When You Die project is about, is to make people have those conversations while they're still in good health. It's not knocking at your door. It somehow to me seems that it's going to be a lighter affair if those big things aren't in the picture.
yeah. I think definitely if you are at a place where you're terminal or something like that, obviously I still think you should do it. But definitely, it's going to be a very different conversation when it's this theoretical thing that we all assume will happen when we're 90, as opposed to okay, the doctor said I have 6 months. It's a lot harder to be funny about that kind of situation. It's a lot easier to be like, oh, when I'm really old and we have holograms and everything's different, if funerals are still the same, here's what I want. Yeah. And it's just in case. Just in case. It's gonna happen. We all don't want it to happen, but just in case.
When you were doing all the research, is there anything that you didn't know that really surprised you or that really stood out?
I think I hadn't realized just because it's not an area that really interests me. I hadn't realized how big green burials are getting. Since then, I've learned if you want to invest in someone who's doing green burial stuff. It is getting huge because obviously people are waking up to the reality of climate change and the planet. And if you live your whole life trying to be green, being buried when you've been embalmed and you're in a memorial park and you're taking up a lot of land and you're in a big casket that's not really going to decompose and excuse me, all these things, you kind of ruin that. Or at least you don't go out the way you tried to live. There's so many different options coming up of green burial. And even while I was writing it, I think actually both Washington and Colorado approved what is not technically known as, but corpse composting, where you are essentially made into compost because people talk about like using their cremains to like feed a tree. Cremains don't have any nutrients. You don't actually feed the tree. It's symbolic. This is a way where you actually are turned into nutrients and can be spread in a garden or with a tree or anything like that. And I'm like, that is so 2 states now I think have approved that. And that again, that happened in the past 2 years when I was literally writing it. So it's something that's getting a lot bigger. And I think a lot of people should know about because I think it's something a lot of people would be interested in.
Absolutely. I just read a thing today now about being buried at sea, where they actually do just put you in a shroud and put you out. There's also a whole bunch of legal things, and you talk about it like, do you need a permit for something? Do you, again, these are things that we don't think about.
Yeah. And those are kind of the things that, especially at the time, become very tedious and annoying and everything. So those are especially the kind of things you can think about beforehand. Some things you need paperwork beforehand. There's something called a body farm. And also, if you want to donate your organs to certain places, you need to have paperwork done before you die. And so that's one thing that you can do now if those are the kind of things that interest you. But then, yeah, burial at sea, it's really cool and it's very green and people are getting into it. And you don't have to be like a sailor or a Navy person, anything like that. But you can't just go dump a in the ocean. That's not allowed. So yeah, there are rules and things and paperwork you need to get. It's very possible, but it's one of those things where it requires a little bit of planning. So you just put in that little bit of planning effort. You know what you have to do, and you know who you have to talk to and what you have to sign. And then that just takes, a whole day of work for someone if they ended up wanting to do that for you.
In all of this, when you're writing this, you have to make you're faced with it. So you're looking at in your own planning. And you're not like the carpenter who doesn't have a door on the house or something, as we always say. You've actually put your money where your mouth is.
Oh, completely. Yeah. Well, before I had been approached to write this or anything, I had and still have, even though I've filled out my own book, have a document on my computer. It just says, if I die, which really should be when I die, but I put if. And it essentially, I then just wrote everything else down in the same way in the book. But it's like, here's what I want, and here's the playlist I want, and all of those things. And some of the things I had already put down then got put into the book. Yeah, okay, playlist and these kind of things. Weirdly, I don't want a traditional funeral. I've kind of lived a lot of very far flung from each other places, and I wouldn't want to ask people to fly across an ocean to come to a funeral or anything like that. And so I made a playlist of 3 songs, and I have a document that I wrote kind of as a goodbye letter, and I update it occasionally as things change. I have a list of people I want that sent to, and then the playlist, which is already on YouTube. Like, here's my playlist. And I want them to just all sit kind of at the same time if possible and just kind of reflect kind of around the world and listen to the songs and read the thing for me and just have like a moment where they can have like private grief and grieve however they want to and be what might be called inappropriate if they were in public. Or I know a lot of introverts who would probably find going to a funeral very stressful. I'm like, you have your private time. Just think about how awesome I was and cry or do whatever you want. Great. Yeah, so that's what I want as a kind of memorial funeral. And I want to be cremated. That's something that I've wanted pretty much as long as I can remember and didn't change even as I researched all the new ways. For me, cremation, that kind of destruction by fire, I just find it very symbolic, and I like the options you have with cremains. So yeah.
So it's all very well and good to fill out the book and have it, but the next thing is it's very important to tell somebody.
Yes, I understand the limitations of my book. I tried to fit everything in there, but there's a lot more. There's people you need to call, there's documents you need to fill out. I cannot encourage enough that you talk to your loved ones. I don't care if you never buy my book and never fill it out. Talk to your loved ones. Just talk to your loved ones, write it down somehow. Just let them know at the very least the basics. And do you want a full burial? Do you want to be cremated? Do you not want anything? Like, do you want to be donated to science? These are the basic of what happens to your body at the very least. And then I always say write a will, for God's sake, write a will, please. You can go on willing and stuff, but I've heard sometimes they can be challenged. So get a lawyer if you can. And then the other one for me is the digital stuff. Let people know, put it anywhere you want, hide it, I don't care. But let people know that there is a document somewhere with your passwords and like your information, and they can get Facebook to take your Facebook and turn it into one of the memorial ones and things like that. Those are kind of for me the big things. And yeah, just seriously talk to people. The thing for me was my family is a family of planners and a very kind of pragmatic, okay, everyone's dying, let's deal with this. And so I've been asked, like, did you want to write this book because you had a bad experience with a funeral? And it's really the opposite, is that my family all did this well before the book existed. My grandmother died. I mean, she died at 94, so it wasn't a surprise. But I think she had her funeral planned from the time she was 60, and everything was done. But even then, there were surprises. Even though she'd had this thing planned and she was 94 and we all knew it was coming, there were still things that were surprising and upsetting and inconvenient. And so I can't imagine what it would be like if all that planning hadn't been there. Instead of this, okay, let's mourn my grandmother, it would have been a disaster. And so I want people to do this because I feel like I've been very lucky. My family's been very lucky in that we haven't had that experience. And I just cannot imagine how bad it is.
What is the response you've been getting from the book?
People really, really like it. I think it's one of those things where I think the people who find it are probably that kind of live slightly weird, it's a niche group. But yeah, it's been really, really positive. I do have one person who was given an advance copy through the publisher and put it on Goodreads, and she gave it 3 stars, which is fine. her kind of complaint in it was that she's like 23 and she doesn't want to. She's like, I filled it out, but I don't really. Why am I thinking about funeral? I'm like, okay, so maybe it's not for the Generation Z group or whatever. Maybe they're a little young for it. But I would hope not. I would hope that people like that would even be interested in it. That's kind of the one that sticks in my mind of like reviews where it's like, okay, there are people this isn't really for, I guess.
But it's kind of the point of the book, though, isn't it? You need to be thinking about it, and even though you don't want to.
Yeah, I would argue that anyone who's going to be like 1 star, it's like, okay, no, you need this book. Like, I know you don't want to think about it. That's the whole point. Yeah.
That's right. It is actually for those people. Well, I have to say it was a delight to read it, and that sounds so weird to say when you're talking about planning a funeral and stuff. Even the cover. So when you talked about the covers that are flowery and lovely and poetic, it's got like a casket with a skeleton and a party hat raising a glass. It's quite funny. I think you can tell from it that it is. Even the title, It's Your Funeral. I mean, that's just such a good title. For me, it was one of those things that I think, like, because of the humor, made it easier. Did you find that the humor made it easier to write?
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. I'm writing my third book now. I'm doing the research and it is decidedly not funny. And so it'll be the first not funny book I've written. And I'm sitting here going, oh man, I'm going to have to like edit out jokes. Like I'm just going to naturally try and like, oh, this is a really serious, sad thing. Let's make a joke. Okay, edit that out. Again, I don't know if it's just because that's my background or the fact that I do find death difficult. I think it's going to be very weird writing it without humor, writing it straight. Something that's so intertwined in my mind now. It's like, okay, we're talking about death. Let's make jokes. Yeah.
Well, I personally appreciate that.
Thank you.
Well, I hope you do really well with it. Again, I really like it. And we certainly had great response from the contest and people wanting to make their plans. So we have this thing that we call the death positive movement. And of course, those people are all over it. But it's to get those little reluctant people who really do need to face it and plan.
The reluctant people, the people who have never heard of the death positive movement but are open to the idea. Just again, it's one of those things where who's it for? Well, we're all gonna die, so it's for everyone. And I lived it. I know what it is to be so terrified of death and to just not be able to think about it. And so with that as my kind of personal background, that's how I write them. Is like what would have helped me when I was at my worst with this fear. A nice, happy little light yellow book with a happy skeleton and jokes and references to Nicolas Cage and things like
I
that.
love the Nicolas Cage references.
Yeah, that kind of book. That'll make
That's
it easy.
lovely. Well, Kathy, thank you so much. Thank you for the book and for talking to us today. And we wish you all the best with it. And now I guess I'll have to brace myself to read something sad.
Yes. The history of Texas is told through its mass graves.
Huh.
Yeah.
That's a small project.
Yeah. It's very depressing.
Amazing.
I'm having fun. Yeah.
That's great. Well, I thank you so much. We'll look for that.
Thank you.
This conversation is brought to you by the When You Die Project. From existential afterlife questions to palliative care and the nuts and bolts of green burial, if it has to do with death, we're talking about it. When You Die